Today, we're going to talk about the city-suburban divide. The 20th century saw the movement of white families from central cities to the suburbs. This movement of white families out of the city is often referred to as white flight. At the same time, black Americans moved into industrial cities, mostly in the north. For white Americans, crime became a signifier of the inner city and the people who lived there. Uh, Crime became thought of as a problem of the city, and the way to escape problems of the city was not to fix the problems of the city, it was to move out of the city. The history of the city-suburban divide is very much one where race plays a role. The federal lending policies uh, of the past allowed and even encouraged racial housing practices. Realtors made sure that blacks stayed out of white neighborhoods by steering them elsewhere, refusing to show them homes in some areas, or rejecting their business altogether. The practice of redlining made it extremely difficult for Americans living in redlined communities to get loans to buy homes. Redlining disproportionately affected minorities and helped exacerbate economic inequality. The federal housing policies that allowed for redlining created an incentive for banks to not lend in places that were considered high risk. Those are the red-lined places, and therefore it was very hard to get a loan in those places. By the 1960s, white flight had become a phenomenon in all American cities. A new kind of poverty emerged where black Americans became highly concentrated in extremely poor areas. Low-income areas became places where people were chronically out of work and out of the social mainstream. Families in poverty lacked health insurance, which overcrowded health clinics and emergency rooms. Now, there are several periods of the development of the suburbs. The romantic suburban ideal, which occurred mainly from 1815 to 1918, is where people began to commute by ferries and streetcar, and there was a growing taste for a quieter environment outside of the industrious cities. There was also a back to nature movement that romanticized nature and rural environments. Suburbs developed as a way to fuse the urban convenience with outside city life. This was followed by a period of the development of automobile suburbs. The automobile altered the relationship between cities and the suburbs. The automobile and subsequent development of the highway system allowed middle-class Americans to move to the suburbs and still work in cities. And then finally, the bedroom suburbs from the period of the late 1940s into the 1970s developed because of the baby boom. The baby boom increased the need for housing, and the space for that housing existed in the suburbs. The need for housing led to the development of standardized home construction, where neighborhoods are filled with homes that look very similar. You see these kinds of suburbs growing today when you see home developments popping up, and all of the homes that are built in those neighborhoods all look the same. Now, there have been some recent developments when it comes to the city-suburban divide, where most of this presentation is focused on how people have moved out of the city and the growth of the suburbs. there is some resurgence of cities. In recent decades, cities have seen some resurgence, and it has become desirable to live in certain areas of the city rather than suburbs. The result of this has been issues with gentrification, where historically poor neighborhoods experience improvements and growth that then pushes the citizens previously living there out of the neighborhood because they can no longer afford the housing. So gentrification becomes a bit of a double-edged sword where you're taking a poorer area and people are investing in it and fixing up, remodeling, building new, and making the neighborhood, fixing up the neighborhood, but then the people that are living there are then being priced out of the rent market as the prices in the area skyrocket and they can no longer afford to live where they've been living. This pushes as a result, uh, the suburbs are becoming more populated with poorer Americans, and those suburbs, which were originally built for middle class Americans, lack the infrastructure to address the needs of the poorer Americans. So, as we see gentrification in certain areas of the city, the poorer people that were living in those areas are forced into the suburbs, and then those suburbs lack the ability to meet the needs of the citizens now living there because those suburbs were built for middle class Americans that could rely on their own resources to get to work. A prime example of this is the need for public transportation. In the city limits, public transportation is much more well developed than out in the suburbs, because it was assumed when the suburbs were developed that the people living in those suburbs could afford to drive a long way to the grocery store, drive a long way to work, drive a long way to get places. But if you have poorer Americans being pushed into the suburbs, then there's a need for public transportation, which is not always available outside of the city. So that is a little bit about the city suburban divide.